So you think you could?
Yeah, I think I'm good. Okay, thanks so much.
No problem. Take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Down to the wire. Everybody's updating Zoom right now.
Hey Bob, are you a mate on the RV Wreckers?
What's that?
Are you a mate on the RV
No, I'm
Wreckers?
not. I am not.
Yeah. I got called for random testing today of all days. So I just had to run up to the center, run back.
How'd you make out? How'd you make out? You
Well, I
passed?
don't know. They just had to, clean the
Mhm.
cup for him.
All right, it's 1 o'clock, but let's wait. People are still rolling in. It's not that many here yet. So we'll start at maybe 1:05. I'll keep an eye on the numbers coming in, and then we'll start at 1:05. All right, attendees keep rolling in, so I'll keep an eye on it. Again, I'm planning to start at 1:05. So another 2-3 minutes. I'm sure the attendees had to update Zoom, as often happens with logging on the Rutgers. Okay, welcome to the webinar on the salt intrusion in the Delaware River. I'm Bob Chant, and I'm going to be the moderator today. This webinar is a series of webinars that's funded by a National Science Conference grant, where Ming Lee is the PI on it, among the other people I list here. And we also have on the panel today is Dave Ralston, who will take part in the discussion. So the program today is going to consist of five talks. I want to give a short introduction to some topics that I think are important, and then in addition to that, we're going to have talks by Dave Bushek, Nam-Soo Sook, Samuel Cook, and Molly Hessen, as it listed here on the first slide. And this should take us about 45 minutes. After that, there'll be a short discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open up for questions to the larger audience attendees. And you can either put an answer in the chat, or if you want to, you can raise your hand or just note in the chat you'd like to ask a question. I can bring you in into the screen here where people can see you and ask a question. So having said that, so again, welcome. And today's talk is again is about saltwater intrusion in the Delaware River, or the salinization of the Delaware River. And the panel here to the left shows the river discharge since 1916 at Trenton. And one topic we're going to hear a bit today is that you can see this is on a log scale. So this is 100 cubic meters per second. This is 1,000 cubic meters per second. And you can see something happened here in the 60s. And that's when the river became managed a bit more stringently about minimum discharges. And a couple of people talk about that today, particularly Nam-Soo. And this is, a very interesting topic. It has conflict between New York and Delaware, and this has appeared in numerous publications, including a recent one a few years back in New York Times, an editorial. And of course, saltwater intrusion into rivers and estuaries is something that is increasingly of concern globally, which is the rationale for this conference series. And I should add that we're going to be having every month or two, there's going to be another webinar on another system. And for example, recently there was a piece in New York Times, this is just yesterday, about saltwater and threatened water supply in Mississippi. So this happens, obviously, a problem worldwide. So a fundamental question you might have about an estuary is how far can salt penetrate up a channel? Okay, and here's a little schematic in a review paper, and we can call that salt intrusion length L. And one could use simple theory, and say that simple theory that L should be related to the river discharge I call Q here, to the negative 1/3 power. Okay, and so that's what theory would say. As you can see, it doesn't scale linearly with the river discharge, but to the negative 1/3 power. This theory, however, works in only this sort of a channel, a classic sort of a prismatic channel. And if this channel could talk, it might say, I am not an estuary, and I'm certainly not Delaware Bay. Because Delaware Bay, of course, looks like this. It's got a funnel-shaped system. It's got wide flanks and shallow and a deep channel down the middle. So both observation and modeling suggest that the estuarine length is much less sensitive than a simple theory in that straight prismatic channel, and it's maybe river discharge to negative 1/6 power. And so it suggests that the salt field doesn't respond that intensely to river discharge. But of course, other things control salt intrusion too. One is the depth that affects the salt intrusion length L. And here I write L is proportional to the depth to some power n. And we can argue, and I'm not going to do it now, whether n should be 2 or 1 or 3, but it certainly scales with n. As it gets deeper, we expect salt to go further upriver. To complicate things, though, it's like, how deep is an estuary? And if you look at the lower panel here, this shows the color is a salt flux from a model result from Rocky Geyer and others. And what you can see in the middle of the channel, this is Delaware Bay, there's a strong salt flux in the deep channel, but on the flanks is very weak. And so what this suggests, and this was done also in an early work by Maria Aristizabal, that the main channel is disproportionately responsible for the total land salt flux. And so, but it's clearly related to sea level or to the depth of the channel. And so, of course, there's sea level rise, which in here I show the annual mean sea level over the last 120 years, and is about a 30 centimeter rise in sea level, which one might expect that to affect salt intrusion length. But the lower panel, what I show is the channel depth over that same period, and what we see is the channel has deepened from maybe 7 meters to almost 15 meters today. And on the top, I show the sea level, and you can see that sea level rise is completely obscured by channel deepening due to dredging. And so dredging significantly deepens the channel, but sea level rise, of course, deepens the whole channel and the flanks. And so both of these probably have some contributions to increasing salt intrusion length. And both observations, here's a paper by Ross of Ray Nadro's group suggesting that based on observations that there's been this long-term increase in salinity throughout the bay. This is a statistical model. So this, the slope upward line indicates an increase of salinity. And then these numerical simulations by Fernando Pereira Roman, where he ran the a model of Delaware Bay with the 1800s bathymetry before they were dredged, and then the more modern bathymetry, you can see there's a much larger salt intrusion length because of dredging. So both these, and again, the main channel, this is the change in depth of the estuary between 1800s and today, and you can see all the deepening is primarily in the main channel. And this, of course, this results in a much more stronger salt intrusion. So, so the salt intrusion obviously affects drinking water, affects other issues in the bay, including a lot of ecological processes in the bay. And so that's Dave Bruchek's going to talk next about some ecological impact, in particular on oyster beds in the bay. So, Dave.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I was just going to provide a little bit of introductory material before I get into oysters, and I guess I'm the outlier here. I'm an oyster biologist and don't study estuarine dynamics except as they relate to shellfish populations and their ecology. So the Delaware River, it's a pretty long river, 532 kilometers. About half of that is tidal, a little bit less than half, I guess. It's the largest free-flowing river on east of the Mississippi in the U.S. Its watershed is about 13,000 square kilometers. It covers 5 states, and as Bob said, it provides drinking water for a lot of people. I don't know, that 17 million might be a little bit high. Might see some lower estimates of the population later. But the lower part of it, the bay, where the oysters are, is surrounded by undeveloped marshes, which has been really beneficial for the ecology of the system over time. It's maintained, it's highly productive, it has diverse amount of wildlife in there. And in it, there's an important oyster population that we help manage as an oyster fishery and have done so for about 70 years or so now at the Haskin Lab. And these things are sensitive to freshwater inflow. And so next slide. Thanks. So managing oysters in Delaware Bay, this is not just something that I do, but I'm working with Jason Morrison and Jen Gaius here at the Haskin Lab, and we're standing upon the shoulders of several other people that came before us, shown over here in the acknowledgements in the lower right. And it traditionally was done under sail, as you see in this picture, and now those boats have been converted to power boats with mechanical dredging systems, as you see in the foreground of this picture. So in any case, next slide. So oyster reefs or the oyster fishery is a unique problem to solve because the oysters build habitat, and this supports all sorts of organisms. It changes water flow, they filter the water and recycle nutrients, they bind carbon, all these sorts of things that they do that you're hearing about a lot, just even in the public press today about how important oysters are to coastal ecosystems. Next. So the problem with the fishery is that they harvest that habitat, and you can click it again. Go ahead and click it 2 more times, I guess. So those promote healthy reef ecosystem, healthy oyster fishery promotes a healthy economy, and we need to balance that somehow. So next slide. So just to give you an idea of how the fishery is set up, you can click through to all the text on here. There you go. Thanks. Whoop. And so this is how the bay is set up for the oyster population. The upper part, those black polygons, are where the wild oyster reefs or oyster beds exist. And the lower area that has those polygons on it, those are our leased planting grounds. And there's approximately 30,000 acres in each of those. And traditionally, what oystermen did is they would harvest small oysters and plant them down in the lower bay where it's a higher salinity. They'd get saltier, develop a nicer flavor, they grow faster. And actually growth and condition, they increase with salinity, but so does predation, disease, and mortality. And that's why the natural beds don't form down there, because the young oysters are often wiped out before they can grow into anything larger that might be marketable. But the larger oysters have some predation releases and do okay once they're down there, but disease can still impact them. Today we have a direct market fishery, and I'll talk. Let's see. I'll talk a little bit about that, but what I want to say finally on this slide is this spatial pattern is tightly correlated with salinity, which kind of indicates the importance of freshwater inflow into the bay. Next slide. So we've known this for quite a long time. This is Thurlow Nelson, who is one of the directors. He was the second director of the Haskin Shellfish Lab after his father, actually. And he was called upon to help ensure that the oyster industry didn't suffer from proposed withdrawals for drinking water in New York City, because he knew that there was a deep dependence of the salinity and the freshwater inflow into here on how healthy the oyster population was. And here in this book volume from 1954, or 1954, I think it is part of his testimony in a case that I think this went to the Supreme Court, if I'm not mistaken. And he notes that there are 2 primary reasons that oysters are dependent upon freshwater inflow. The first is to keep back natural enemies. So those are the predators and things like that. So oyster drills, starfish, animals like that require more marine-like conditions. They don't tolerate lower salinities quite as well. And so the lab for many years was responsible for identifying where was the salt, what they called the drill line, where oyster drills, how far up the bay could they live, and what kind of impact would they be on there. But today there's 2 significant diseases, 2 pathogens that kill oysters, called MSX and dermo, and those are really what limits the population in the lower bay today. But the second thing, which is sort of less intuitive, is that in that freshwater flow coming down provides a lot of the nutrients that's needed to support phytoplankton and the detritophores that would eat some of the detritus that's coming down here and form the basis of the food web in Delaware Bay. So it's really important to ensure that there was sufficient flow coming down the bay to support all that if he was going to support the oyster population. Next slide. So while this was all recognized back then, the overall this is the overall management system is really a wonderful collaboration between the resource agency that manages it, the industry that harvests it, and an independent scientific organization, Rutgers University, that helps provide data that helps inform the decision-making of that to manage the bay. And while we have really strong connections throughout here, one thing that's missing is the freshwater inflow. And so we need to revisit that. Although that was recognized way back then, it's not strictly part of this program today. And it's not intuitive how this might impact things, but we might look at how some recent freshets have impacted the system. So let me provide an example on the next slide. So many of you may remember hurricane or tropical storms Irene and Lee when they passed through, wherever you were, depending on whether it was a hurricane or a tropical storm. But the long and short of this is that there was a tremendous amount of rainfall in the watershed that feeds the Delaware Bay. Next slide. And so Daphne Monroe and other colleagues here at Rutgers worked together to look at what the impact was on that. I mean, we actually saw it in our routine sampling program. We started seeing mortality of the oysters. And we went back and modeled what was actually happened there from the salinity records we had that DRBA has, that the coast, that the NOAA has at their monitoring stations. And we identified that salinity below about 7 for about 3 weeks will cause severe mortality in oysters. The mortality followed the salinity gradient such that those oysters on the uppermost beds, they sustained about 75% mortality, whereas none occurred on the lower bay beds. In fact, survival actually increased on the lower bay beds, which wasn't immediately intuitive to us until we started looking at disease. We realized that the lowering of salinity on the lower bay released those animals from disease pressure. And I can show you a long-term plot of that on the next slide here. And so here, what you see is this is harvest data, but it's really a surrogate measure for the population for the most part. And we began surveying the populations in the 1950s at the request of the industry when they had noted sharp declines that were likely a result of unrestricted harvesting at the time. So there at about 1960, Hal Haskin, who was the director of the lab at the time and was responsible for recommending management strategies, he implemented a harvest control restriction, was probably the first of its kind for shellfish populations. And the result was this increasing trend in harvest you see up until about 1980. And then in the 80s, there was a resurgence of this disease, MSX, that caused essentially a disease collapse and a reduction in the harvest. And as that began to rebound, a warming trend that was coincident with that allowed another pathogen that's a warm water pathogen called dermo to move into the bay and establish itself there. And we've been living with those two parasites since then. And so my immediate predecessor, Eric Powell, when he was directing the lab, along with John Corder, who I think is on the call here, implemented a different management system. So instead of harvesting small oysters and moving them down bay and waiting for them to grow, they implemented what's called a direct market fishery. So previously it was called a seed fishery, and that's called a direct market fishery, where only market-sized oysters are harvested off of those beds and taken directly to market. And in doing so, we were able to, although at a reduced level, reestablish the industry at a more sustainable level, as you can see there. And in that first couple of years, we did a lot of experimentation to identify what's a sustainable harvest level. So you see a lot of up and down there. And then you see that's that first yellow line. That second yellow line shows you where we took that information, we're able to stabilize the harvest at around 75,000, 76,000 bushels a year. And then Hurricane Irene and Lee came, and we thought, oh no, we're going to lose the industry again. But to the contrary, that release of disease pressure on lower bay beds actually expanded the harvestable population significantly. And we actually moved into a higher equilibrium state as a result of that amount of freshwater flow coming down that was put, well, although it was very detrimental to the upper bay beds, it had a very positive effect on the lower bay beds. And I think that dovetails nicely with the need to protect things like drinking water in the upper part of the bay. Next slide. So this is just my last slide. Today we have a sustainable fishery, and it's quite stable, which is good for the industry and for the state and their management of it. And that's dependent upon these things: the industry, regulator, researcher, collaborative management, the quantitative survey that we do to establish a quota, as well as rebuilding programs to replenish the harvest. So the oystermen actually invest in the industry and will rebuild any beds that they harvest through shell planting activities. But what we need is this freshwater inflow management. And we need it for essentially the same reason that it's used for protecting drinking water, and that is to keep the saltiest water down bay. And I think I'll stop there, and Bob, you can move things on.
Okay, thank you, Dave. That's very, very interesting and good example of freshwater implications in the bay. So next we'll go to Nam Su of the Delaware River Basin Commission.
Good afternoon. Let me start with the left-hand side figure showing the simple Delaware River Basin map. The main stem Delaware River flows from the Hancock, New York to the Atlantic Ocean. It travels 330 miles long. Delaware River Basin Commission, or DRBC, is a federal interstate compact agency established in 1961. So governors of 4 states are our commissioners, and also commanding general of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. North Atlantic Division is our federal representative. Compact granted broad basin management authorities to DRBC, providing for planning, conservation, development, management, and control of water resources in the basin. But today's presentation focuses on the water supply management side. So next slide, please. So this map shows total population served by within the Delaware River Basin and also outside of the basin through diversions. So approximately 14 million people relies on that Delaware River as a source water for drinking water. Actually, the figure is not updated, so actual number, most recent study done in 2020 is about 14.2 million people. From here, I'd like to highlight one location marked as a red, yellow star in the middle of the map, Trenton, New Jersey. That's the head of the tide of the Delaware River. So today's talk, the fresh tidal river, we will cover below that Trenton area. So let's look at below Trenton area a bit in the next slide. So let's see some historical perspective of Delaware River. The left-hand side figure picture shows the 1965 drought condition and 2023 about normal flow, a little bit higher than normal flow condition at Trenton. And the Delaware River experienced severe drought in 1960s. And that 1960s drought impact on salt intrusion. So right-hand side figure, let me go through a number of things. So those pinkish line area is the typical salt front location, usually located around River Mile 70. And during the drought of 1960s, showing the red star, salt front reaches up to River Mile 102. And the nearest intake in tidal fresh water is the River Mile 110. That's the Philadelphia water intake. And also the other side, Camden intake is located there too. So during the persistent extreme drought condition can threaten source water quality in tidal fresh Delaware River. Let's go to the next slide, please. Let's start from left-hand side figure first. So this shows a series of reservoirs that can be utilized to mitigate the flooding and drought conditions, and to ensure that sufficient water flows downstream of New York City reservoirs. New York City reservoirs showing on top right side of that figure, those 3 reservoirs. So there are 2 flow targets set through the main stem Delaware. Bob clicked twice. So one is Montague, New Jersey, set the flow target through the Supreme Court decree. The flow target is maintained by the Delaware River Master. And another flow target is set Trenton, New Jersey, through DRBC's water code in 1980s. DRBC managed the flow target. And there are a number of variabilities or extreme weather conditions, or especially through the sea level rise impact, we have more concern about the salt intrusion. Next slide, please. So from previous figure, I rearranged the reservoirs here. Let's go through the this figure starting from the right-hand side first. So top right, 3 reservoirs are owned by New York City for water supply purposes. And New York City withdraws 800 million gallons per day for their drinking water purposes. And below, another yellow arrow below there. So New Jersey also withdraws 100 million gallons per day through DNR Canal. And in the middle is a schematic line for the Delaware River. There are two red dots again at the Montague. That flow target under the normal operating condition. The flow target is 1750 cubic feet per second. Trenton flow target is 3,000 cubic feet per second. And those flow targets during normal conditions are necessary to ensure that downstream diversions and downstream users get sufficient water for their needs and also support recreation use or fulfills ecological needs. Let's move to the left-hand side, not yet, left-hand side. Let's skip number, it has different color, dark gray. Color ones are flood control reservoirs, so let's skip them. And light gray color reservoirs are the multipurpose reservoirs. And some portion of the storage is designated to be used to meet flow targets during the normal and drought conditions. So let's see different conditions change flow targets in the next slide. So it's a bit easy, but let's start from top right, multiple line ones. This is the plot of New York City reservoirs combined storage. So y-axis in percentage from 0 to 110%, and x-axis throughout 1 year from June to June in this case. The top line shows the long-term median values of storage over the year. And the green line, 2 lines below, is the drought watch line. So if actual combined storage is above the green line, the river is managed as a normal condition. So flow target is set as 1750 at Montague and 3,000 for Trenton, and diversions are normal. But if the actual storage is below the green line, then flow target is lowered, as shown in left-hand side table, row 3, top left figure, no, top left. So drought watch has a flow target Montague lower to 1650, and Trenton target flow lower to 2700 CFS. And also, if you go to bottom right table, the diversions under the drought watch, New York City diversion, all the way, yeah, that's right. So under the watch, New York City diversion reduced down to 680 MGD, but New Jersey diversion maintained to 100. Same for the yellow line is the drought warning, and the red line is the drought emergency. So it's if actual storage is below the red line, this triggers the drought emergency. Among other things like water conservation, the diversions to New York City and New Jersey are reduced, and flow targets lowered to 1100 for Montague and 2500 CFS for the Trent. However, depending on the salt front location, that flow target may be raised up to ensure that salt front is pushed down. So the middle bottom of that table shows depending on salt front location downstream of river mile 82.9, then Montague flow target is 1100, but top of there upstream of river mile 92.5, if salt front creeps up, then it directed more releases from that additional reservoirs to ensure that salt front is not creep up. So the principal concept of flow management in Delaware River Basin is that number one, minimum flows are maintained to meet downstream users' needs during the normal conditions. Depending on the severity of the drought condition, the flow targets and diversions are reduced to preserve water supply storage in upper basin, mainly New York City reservoirs. However, during those drought emergency conditions, if the salt front is moving upstream, additional releases are directed to ensure to protect drinking water intakes in tidal freshwater, mainly Philadelphia and Camden, from the high salinity. Next slide, please. So reservoir operations, flow management, flow needs, water availability, etc. Those are all water quantity related issues, and policy discussions happen on the following listed of forums on the DRBC. But I'd like to highlight today that the last one, Advisory Committee on Climate Change, which was newly formed in 2019 to address climate change impact on water resources. One of the key charges is that the DRBC developed a three-dimensional hydrodynamic model to evaluate impacts of salt intrusion at various sea level rise scenarios and potential mitigation measures. The draft report is under internal review and expected to be released sometime this year. Next slide, the last one. This is my last slide showing the dashboard for daily conditions for flow management. I provided link, somehow link does not show up in this slide. Bob, I think this may not be the final version. So if you post it, please use the final version, has the link to this site.
Okay.
So if anyone has further interest, I suggest starting from this link, and additional useful link available bottom right corner. So to learn more about that DRBC's flow management program. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Namsu. Some obviously very important work for DRBC. So next we'll hear from Samuel Cook of United States USGS, United States Geological Survey in Troy, New York.
Yeah, do you want me to share or do you want to go next? Doesn't matter.
I'll just go. You say go next.
Yeah, okay, that sounds great. Hi everyone, I'm Salma Cook. I'm an oceanographer hydrologist at USGS, and I'm going to focus on modeling salinity intrusion in Delaware Bay. Next slide. So as you've seen in Namsu's presentation, the Delaware River Basin supports a large population in several states for drinking, agricultural, and industrial use. About 5 million people in New York City and New Jersey rely on diverted water. And the previous presentation showed that complex reservoir system whose operations affect the flow of water down the main stem. So for the modeling studies today, I'm focusing just on the portion of the Delaware that is south of Trenton, which is also where the head of tide is. But it's just important to know that river discharge at Trenton is made up of both managed and natural flows. Next slide. So the USGS's mission in this is to be the science arm of the Department of the Interior, and we use data and expertise to support decision-making. So we have a couple science questions that we're really interested in, and we use models to try and answer. Those three are, what are the main contributing factors that result in the movement of the salt front upstream? What role does bathymetry play in salinity intrusion? You heard a little bit about deepening of the harbor channel and what that might do. And how do low pressure systems import or export salt into the bay? I should say that the Office of the Delaware River Master actually sits within the USGS, and the current River Master is Kendra Russell. So just wanted to make a plug for that. Next slide. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what the salt front is. Its definition can change based on like the coastal system you're in. In Delaware, it's the 7-day average of the 250 milligram chloride per liter line, which is about 0.5 PSU. practical salinity units. It's based on a regression of the conductivity measurements at 4 different USGS gauges. And if you want to know more about that, actually the link to NAMSU's hydrologic page will show it there. Shown below is the observed daily average of the salt front. So I'm looking at daily for the purposes of this sort of modeling talk. And that's the red line. And the discharge is in blue. I'll be showing several figures that look like this. So I sort of want to take some time orienting this figure. The x-axis, I'm going to be talking about 2019 for the most of this presentation. The y-axis on the left is the location of the salt front and river mile. And the y-axis on the right is Trenton discharge, and that's in CFS. So river mile 0 is the mouth of the Delaware, and mile 110 is a drinking water intake. So that's how high the y-axis goes. So if you squint, you can see that the median location of the salt front is about 67, river mile 67 to 76, which was described in the last presentation. Other patterns to note that there are big swings in the salt front location with respect to spikes in river discharge, and a shift in early July where the salt front is less responsive to river discharge. And that was touched on, Bob touched on that a little bit. The sort of salt intrusion length for river discharge might change over time. And then there's a shift in early July where the salt front is less responsive to river discharge. River discharge wanes in the summer and fall, and the salt front makes a slow creep upriver. The horizontal dotted line is 3,000 CFS, which during non-drought conditions is the Trenton flow target. And during times of drought, this line will change based on reservoir storage, future rain predictions, current discharge conditions, the location of the salt front. So that target can change based on several things. So you can see other bumps and wiggles in the salt front location, which is due to storm systems. So that's the early October spike and then drop. To get a better sense of what's driving this behavior, we use models as tools. So I'm not going to go into details about the specific model due to our time constraints. The next slide, I'll show you time series of salinity at 2 points. You can go to the next slide. And so here you see a 2-week snapshot of salinity at Chester, Pennsylvania, which is the top figure. That's river mile 83, and Reedy Island, which is at river mile 54. This is just to show you how the model represents 2 time series and salinity over time, comparing to observed values at these locations. What's different about this slide is you can see tidal variations in salinity over that 2-week period. And in the next slide, I'll show you sort of salt front, how the model represents salt front. Yeah, you can go to the next slide. All right. So this is including model results in with those observed values I showed before. You have the observed daily in red. You have discharge in blue, same as before. And now you have modeled daily average values in that black line and hourly values in yellow. So you can see the main behaviors are captured in the model, and that during any given day, the salt front can move 5 to 10 miles. I will note that of those 4 gauges that are used in that regression to make the salt front line, the farthest south point is river mile 54. So any big swings south of river mile 54 have large error bars. Next slide. All right, so starting with river discharge, these are the 4 main sort of mechanisms I'm going to talk about. You can see during winter and spring months, the system is driven by natural discharge. And the summer and fall months, the discharge at Trenton is managed to those values described in the flexible flow management program. The next process I want to talk about is tidal action. So you see those daily values, which is the yellow line. And then we have spring neap cycles. So during spring tides, the range in water levels is greatest. You have higher high tides and lower low tides. And you have stronger tidal currents and stronger mixing. Whereas during neap tides, the opposite is true. And if there's less mixing due to tidal action, you can then get a situation where stratification can grow and salt can move further upstream. In late June of 2019, you can see an example of a transition from neap to spring to neap to spring. And you can see that big jump. And so after that point, the salt front hangs out around river mile 68, and then it passes a point and it sort of creeps up to river mile around 80. The next I want to talk about is meteorological systems. So that means winds, waves, subtidal water levels. You can think storm surge. In October, there's two meteorological events. There's subtropical storm Melissa, which is sort of a remote storm, so an offshore storm which pushes salt into the system. And then a few days later, we have a bomb cyclone, which is a more of a local event, which happens over the estuary, over the bay, and pushes salt downstream. And then the last thing I want to talk about is bathymetric control points. There's a few clear points here you can see, one around River Mile 70, which for most of the year, the salt front is sort of bumping up against that. And then there's a point where sort of there's a regime shift. There's something that changes. And then the salt front sort of changes its behavior. There's a couple others around River Mile 82 and 88, and there's some bathymetric changes there, but you can see those are points where the salt front hits and comes back down or hangs out for a few days until something happens, right? River discharge increases, some tides change, something happens. And so I want to compare this to the next and sort of last slide is comparing 2019, which is actually a relatively high discharge spring, to 2016, which is a low discharge year. Next slide. All right, and so this is the last slide, so you can stare at it all you want. The things I want to note here are the differences in river discharge. If you squint, you can see the blue line is much less active on the left side, and it's way more active on the right. You can see that the salt front crosses the River Mile 70 line in early June 2016 versus mid to late August in 2019. So if you're managing a reservoir system, looking at the biology of fish populations or oysters, understanding when and where that salt front moves earlier in the year, it might help you sort of manage your system better. Some of our other research, I just want to put a plug for this in, is focused on using our model to relate to oyster mortality in the lower Delaware Bay. At some of the oyster beds Dave pointed out, we're looking at the spatial distribution of salinity, and in another project, we're looking at the effects of increased precipitation and sea level rise on salt front dynamics in sort of a bigger picture way. And that's my last slide. If you want more detailed information, there's a paper that was published earlier this year that describes the model in detail and some of these dynamics in detail. And that's all I've got.
Okay, thank you, Salma. Excellent, really nice story. Always like seeing bathymetry rear its head. Okay, our last talk here by Molly Hessen. Take it away, Molly.
Yes, hi, my name is Molly Hessen, and I'm a contractor to the Philadelphia Water Department for the past 17 years. I support their water supply planning programs, and we do a lot of reservoir optimization modeling as well as salinity modeling and infrastructure planning. And I wanted to talk about our multi-year water supply planning effort, where we're looking to support internally here at the utility our water and wastewater infrastructure planning efforts. And there's a critical need for us to understand the risks to our infrastructure, regulatory compliance, and ultimately sort of our role as a drinking water utility in the public health of the customers in Philadelphia. And we provide drinking water to all of Philadelphia County. So water supply planning specifically for the Philadelphia Water Department is vulnerable to three critical drivers. I'm going to walk through these. The first is ambient water quality changes, sea level rise, and policy changes. Oh, next slide, please. So the Philadelphia Water Department is located at the bottom of the Delaware River Basin. We have two drinking water intakes on the Schuylkill River, and they're located in the non-tidal section of the Schuylkill River. Our third drinking water intake, which is our largest, is located in the tidal Delaware River, right up near where Bob's Arrow is. And so our Delaware River drinking water intake is vulnerable to salinity intrusion. We've only experienced ocean salt at our intake once in the 1960s, a very small amount, but it was ocean salt, and that triggered some large scale policy changes that are critical to this day. Next slide, please. So moving into our drivers as to why we have a water supply planning program and why that's needed, the ambient water quality that we see at our Baxter intake. So all the fresh water coming down from the watershed has changed pretty dramatically when it comes to the chloride concentration. In fact, since the 1950s, where we have record keeping on the Delaware River at Trenton, we've observed a tripling of the chloride concentrations. And this is critical because as a drinking water utility, our treatment train does not remove chloride. So any sources of salt that we have, there's not really anything that we can do to remove them. So if the fresh water is increasing due to development pressure and road salt, we see those increases coming through our tap. Next slide change. Sort of the second big driver for water supply planning is sea level rise. As the other presentations have noted, salinity, bathymetry, depth, all of these things are related, as are the reservoir and management policies that the DRBC presented. So while policy changes have been acted over time to mitigate and reduce salinity intrusion within the vicinity of the drinking water intake, sea level rise has occurred. 1984 was when the first salinity control policies were put in place. That policy is called Good Faith. And the most recent policy, the FFMP that was enacted in 2017, there's been about 1/2 foot of sea level rise. Yet the flow targets have remained the same. Now, thankfully for the Philadelphia Water Department, through our modeling and through our understanding of the flow targets, we know that the current flow targets remain protective, despite that 1/2 foot of increase. But the current policy is slated to go be effective through 2028. So we've engaged in a lot of modeling to understand what this sea level rise driver is going to do to salinity intrusion, and ultimately what that means for the Philadelphia drinking water intake. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide talking about the policy driver. Salinity intrusion is critical. As I mentioned, we can't remove salt. So if over time we have more salt coming towards us, that means more salt coming through our intake. So PWD has embarked on the construction and operation of a 3-dimensional estuary model. We use EFDC, and one of our main priorities is making sure that the policies in place remain protective of the Philadelphia drinking water intake. And one of the things that we've been using our model to understand is what are the freshwater flow combinations on 2 tributaries that are affected by the reservoir releases, and what do those flow combinations mean in terms of the maximum location of the salt line. Salme did a great job introducing what the salt line is. It's the 7-day average 250 milligram per liter location of this particular isochlor in the estuary. Now, our drinking water intake is at river mile 110. So we don't see in any of these scenarios. So all of these scenarios are looking at a combination of Delaware River flow and Schuylkill River flow. The Delaware River is managed. It has a flow target at Trenton, as Namsu presented on. And given the different drought scenarios, normal condition, the Delaware River is at 3,000, drought watch 2,900, drought warning 2,700, and in drought emergency, it's about 2,500, but that changes given the location of the salt line. So it's critical for the city of Philadelphia to understand the relationship between sea level rise, freshwater flow coming down the Delaware River, the concentration of ambient salt coming down the Delaware River, as well as the sort of unmanaged amount of flow coming down the second largest tributary in the Delaware, which is the Schuylkill River. And you can see that as we vary the Schuylkill River flow among these different modeling scenarios, the salt line can change upwards of 2 miles, which is a big difference, given that the salt line there's a gradient in front of it. And if it's 2 miles closer to us, the salt line might not be at our intake, but we could see ocean salt in several of these scenarios. So I just want to thank everyone for allowing me to present today, and I'm sort of tying everything together from a drinking water perspective.
All right. Thank you, Molly. That was great. Good wrapping it up. Let me stop sharing. Okay, so I guess we'll open up to general questions from the panel, and then we have about 40 minutes left, and then we'll go over to the larger audience. Well, I'll start with a question. So has anybody looked at if we had the 1960 drought the 60s drought today, what would the situation look like? I mean, are we using more water today than we were in the 60s, and what would the reservoir situation look like?
Yeah, so there's actually more water now in the reservoirs than there were in the 1960s. Two of the big New York City reservoirs were empty. One had yet to start filling and the other was, drained because of the drought. So we are in a much better freshwater flow perspective. We get about 1,000 more CFS at Trenton. In the 60s, flow got down to 1,100, 1,200. And now we get about 2,200, 2,100 from that. It can get a little bit lower, but we're in a much, much better position according to our reservoir optimization model than what it tells us the reservoirs can do now. Now they could have done it in the 60s, but they were empty. They were empty, and the flow target at Montague during drought conditions was higher than it is now. Now the flow target at Montague is cut back during drought conditions to allow for that reservoir storage in the New York City system.
There's some question. Dave, you asked a question in the chat.
Yeah,
You want to
sure.
ask it?
The first one is just relative to where the salt actually is when it's on the bottom and usually in the channel. Where are the intakes relative to that?
Sure. So our intake is a surface water intake or a gravity intake. We sort of open our gates on our raw water basin on the incoming tide, and then we close it on slack tide before the water goes back out. There is an intake right across the river from us, and their intake is not necessarily located in the channel, but off to the side. But so they're a subsurface intake and we are a surface intake.
And
But
then,
at the same time, the where the intake is located, Delaware estuary is highly energetic and dynamic. So the salt, whatever comes up, is basically laterally, vertically, and fully mixed.
Yeah,
So,
it's
The
well mixed.
location
So,
doesn't matter.
yeah, we
okay.
don't consider that an issue up where we are, or a protective feature.
So then the other question I had was relative to releases. How fast does the salt line respond to a release? And similarly, how fast does it return once increased, whether it's a release or a flooding event or whatever?
I think one way to think about the reservoir releases is that they are a dilution factor. They're not necessarily pushing the salt per se. They're diluting that gradient. And they're really only capable of mitigating the ocean salt concentration in a very, very limited geographic range. And that's something that we're going to look into studying pretty extensively with our model. Obviously it matters if people are placing expectations on reservoir releases that they're not capable of following through on from a geographic perspective. Can we really manage the salt in Chester or not really? We can dilute it a little bit. Can we manage the salt in front of PWD's intake? 20 miles north of there? Yeah, like obviously the further you get up tide, you see a much larger ability to mitigate salt. And so sort of one of the things that we're looking at is where is that range of capabilities of these releases?
Yeah, if I add, I mean, that is an excellent question, but it really depends on the magnitude of pulse of flow. So if there's a big enough chunk of flow comes in, that can push down not only dilution, but if that additional flow is, I cannot put the numbers on it, but it will serve as just additional dilution only, as Molly said. So these are great scenario ones that the model can handle, that what's the magnitude triggering the push that salt front, and how much, what's the trigger amount or magnitude.
So the flow, during drought is, from 2,500 CFS to 3,000 CFS, and these releases are on the orders of 100 CFS. So they're a whole order of magnitude lower than the flow. They're not larger than the flow. They're not equal than the flow. They're quite a bit less than the flow, and they're diluting at the margin.
Okay, there's a couple questions here in the Q&A section. I'll go ahead and read them. One is from and again, if anybody wants to ask a question, I can they can answer live if they want. But the first one is Dr. Abraham Zia. He's asked, what type of policy for wastewater management along the urban settlement, along the creek area or reservoirs related to groundwater salinization? So I guess question, what kind of wastewater management is in the Philadelphia? It's quite a bit. So
Yeah, sure. So Philadelphia has 3 large wastewater plants. Nearly all of the city wastewater is run through a treatment plant. So there's 3 large discharge points managed through the Clean Water Act going into the estuary. And then so about 40% of the city is through a combined sewer system. So a lot of that that water during drought goes through our treatment plants. And then about 60% of the city is on a separate stormwater sewer system. So I'm not sure if that's what you're getting at. If your question's more about maybe road salt regulation or something, we don't really have that. But Philadelphia County is fully sewered, and most of it goes to a wastewater plant.
there's another question by Alex Horner Divine.
Bob, can I
ahead.
add some of the Molly's answer that another way to say is a commission has a water quality standards or criteria for main stem Delaware River for chlorides, for example, but it's not exceeding that criteria yet. And also for point source discharges perspective or wastewater treatment perspective, there's an effluent limit on TDS, basically total dissolved solid. So it's indirectly controlling chloride or dissolved solid.
Okay. And this next question here is from Alex Horner Divine, University of Washington. He said we saw a big impact from storms. How long do these storms impact last? If the duration of the impact is short, is that something that PWD can work around with their existing system?
I can just say a little bit before Molly chimes in, but yeah, they're pretty short. I mean, the daily average location of the salt front does move about a mile like a day, like the actual average moves up. So it's pretty big movement, but where it moves. So in 2019, it was around river mile 80 to 83, which still isn't at a point where it triggers any sort of management or any sort of movement. It's really if that storm happens and the salt front's higher than that is what I would say, right, Molly?
Yep, absolutely. And I think this sort of example of a setup event that Salme presented is something that needs to be investigated as one of those rare scenarios. Sort of what would the impact be on salinity intrusion simultaneous to a large setup event like that? Now it gets complicated, right? Because these events tend to bring rain. We're talking about maybe a setup or a wind or an offshore event in the absence of rain would be something, more along the lines of that we would need to look at. But that is something that PWD is looking into now that we've made it through sort of a primary series of runs comparing different freshwater flow inputs and salinity movement. So storms are certainly an interest, and the influence of storms are certainly an interest to both PWD as well as USGS, given the complications of these mechanisms that push the salt line around.
Sort of a related question is maybe to Selma, because I'm a little confused by on one hand we always say, oh, it's so insensitive to river discharge, but yet you see these pulses of river so really move the upper part of the salt line downstream. So is there asymmetry in response to the salt line? Like it moves up slowly and gets washed down quickly, or?
I think and especially in the Delaware, it's very location dependent. And so around river mile 68, I'd say it's I mean, you can see right now, if you look at that ArcGIS dashboard, you can see there's a huge rain event, huge discharge event, and the salt front is still at river mile 68. Like it hasn't been flushed out. So I think this is where it's time dependent, space dependent, and where it gets a little tricky. So, and talking about the plug of flow down, if you can send like a perfect plug of water down the Delaware and the salt front's at a point where it's insensitive to that plug, so I really think, it's insensitive to river discharge, but also depending where you are, where the salt front is at that time. I know it's like a complicated answer, but that's sort of what we found.
Complicated system.
I wonder if you could expand on, I mean, this is for the whole panel, but thinking about why that 7-day average is sort of the way in which we think about the salt line. Why is that a useful concept? Just because you imagine, for example, a lot of variability on other time scales, at the storm time scale, but even on the tidal time scale, it's sloshing back and forth like 6 miles every tide. And so I guess maybe it's sort of why should we be thinking about in terms of that 7-day average? Or
You don't have to. You don't have to think about it that way. And as oceanographers, I don't think that you should. Those of us that are semi-regulated by this and that our policies are governed, they use that metric. And it might be that over time we think that that is an antiquated metric, but it really is just that. It's a metric. It's a quick and dirty policy metric. So feel free to use and propose other things.
Well, would you propose other things?
Yeah, I think that for us, it's a helpful warning metric. We know that the gradient in front of what the definition of the salt line is about 8 to 10 miles. And so for us, it's helpful to know that if the salt line approaches river mile 99, river mile 100, that we might start to see a milligram here, a milligram there of ocean salt that we can attribute to that larger gradient. But like I said, it's about 10 miles, 8 to 10 miles between what I'm saying is sort of no ocean salt at our intake and the 250 milligram per liter isochlor, which is a combination of, I would say, about 45 milligrams per liter local salt plus ocean salt.
Dave, was there anything known that happened to the oyster population in the 60s drought?
In the 60s drought, I'd have to look back at the data set. I don't know. There, Jen or John Corder, I don't know if you can unmute or not, might know.
If they want to put, if you want to, if either you want to answer, post something in the chat, and I'll make you able to talk. No.
We did see a big response at that point, a big increase in the population in the overall, but I think that was more related to big shell planting efforts that were going on by the industry in the state at that time.
As always is the case, it's complicated. There's other things happening, right? Right.
Yeah, they were putting down 500,000 bushels of
There's
shells.
John got his hand up. Let me get him. I got to get. Where's my hand? Raised hands. Hold on. I have to go find John. Here he is. All right, John, you can talk now. If you want to mute yourself, I think, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yep.
I can't answer the 60s question, but I was sort of curious as to what, with the channel deepening that took place in the 2020, has anybody noticed a change in the tidal amplitude in Trenton? Because historically, there were some reports out that suggested due to channel deepening, the tidal amplitude in Trenton had like doubled or something like that. I can't remember the exact numbers. But what that does, if you're driving salt farther up the estuary because of that channel deepening, it's likely to spill out onto the seed beds, which then affects the disease and stuff. So it's a lot. There's a lot of subtleties farther down that mostly what you're talking about is freshwater supply, and the biology responds more to the extremes than the static condition. If you put static conditions in the Delaware estuary, you would decrease the oyster population dramatically. It relies on the flashiness of the system to maintain the disease and predator lines and all the other interactions that take place. So the more you manage the system towards static conditions, the more you're going to decrease what goes on in the biology of the system. And it's something that's hard to keep in mind because it's sort of anathema to all the management that you want to do for the fresh water supply. But I'm just curious whether the tidal amplitude in Trenton has changed at all, because it's pretty dramatic if you look back through time, at least the reports that I read years ago. You know, it's like a doubling.
Yeah, it definitely has increased over time. I mean, Fernando, who's on the call here, had published a paper on that also based on data in Philly, and it probably increased too. But Fernando, did your data go to 2020? It probably stopped before that most recent deepening.
Yeah, I think it was 2014.
Okay. I have a question here from Sujay. I'm gonna allow Sujay to talk. This is one of the PIs on this project. Go ahead, Sujay.
Hi, thanks, Bob. I was just wondering if the changes in salinity are linked to any kind of harmful algal blooms at all, because people have shown that you know, the salinity can affect zooplankton populations. I didn't know if that was an issue in Delaware, in the Delaware River.
My answer is we do not know at this point. We actually Delaware estuary or bay, we believe that harmful algal blooms are not occurring or major issue at least. But we start to some monitoring starting from about 3 years ago. So we will track more longer term data and we will see any impacts over time. But I do not have enough data to answer to your question though.
Thanks.
I see. Phil, you have a question? You can.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for everyone's talks and thank you, Salmi. It was really you know, good talk, and also appreciate your work on that model. I've also recently completed some research from, you know, with Bob Chant in the same area, and we coincided on where some of these bathymetric control points were, but I didn't see anything at River Mile 87, which is around Tinicum Island. And well, it was, you know, our events were timed with 2014, where the salt front hadn't made it up that far. And I'm asking this question more in this, you know, not in the specific answer in your results, but like more in an operational sense. Is there something in these control points that are, you know, sometimes a danger and sometimes a help? Like, it seems like sometimes they're a barrier, but then at other times they provide a pulse for moving salt more beyond where it wouldn't necessarily go.
Yeah, I think it's the eye of the beholder, right? But yeah, there's definitely a big control point at 70, and that's where the Delaware Memorial Bridge is. There's a huge, deep sort of hole, and then there's like a bit of a sill, and the Christina River comes in right there. So there's a lot of interesting things going on right there. Once sort of the daily 7-day average gets past that point, sort of all bets are off until you have like a big event that pushes it back down past that point. 82, there is also sort of a bathymetric, sort of a drop, and then there's sort of a channel that ends around 87, 88. But to your point, one of the problems with salt intrusion is we only have so many events to look at historically. And so I don't know if 87 is a really important control point. It's one that I've seen the salt front stop at, but I don't have enough data points to really determine it, like what the, you know, how that bathymetry controls the salt at that point. And so I think looking at River Mile 68 and doing a bunch of different sort of model scenarios would be really intriguing to me, because I think that's a really important one.
We see River Mile 88 a lot when the flow targets are acting on Trenton and they're holding Trenton at 3,000. So it might, just one idea is it might just be less a bathymetry control point and more where the freshwater flow is able to sort of maintain that concentration. And then once you go down in flow at Trenton, you see it really start to move. So maybe it's one of those maybe it's a sort of a transfer between a bathymetric control and then a freshwater control. If you look at sort of the long-term record since the 60s of where the salt line location is, it doesn't get much past that because of the flow targets.
That's a really good point, Molly.
There's a widening of the river there too.
Marcus,
that
yeah.
map now.
The question for Sami from Abraham Zia. In case of a storm surge, what type of shift in salt front impacts do you see in the bay? Like, so what's the excursion during a typical storm event? I guess it probably depends, right?
Yeah, I think it depends, and it depends on the type of event. So storm surge in this case, yeah, an offshore event usually see the signal at Luz and Cape May. And you just see the entire bay become salty. I mean, it's like or at least bottom, if I'm looking at bottom salt, like the bottom few cells of the model. And it just pushes through that channel all the way upstream. And you can see, like I said, the daily average moves a mile a day, which means that 5 miles moving, it's really going up, but it doesn't really look, at least with certain storms, it doesn't look like it stays up. It's just, you've got like a flash event and then it sort of comes back down to whatever that next bathymetric control is that balances river discharge and whatever tides you're in, and it sort of stabilizes. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, so you're saying it's kind of symmetrical. I mean, it gets shot up during a surge and then it comes back similarly. There was not a asymmetry to that response.
Yeah, and wherever it comes back to is really dependent on what happens after that storm event.
Right. So, but it's not like it can punch through the Delaware Memorial Bridge during a storm and then remain up there after that. So it tends to come.
Can if you're right. So Molly's point, right? If you have an offshore storm and there's not a lot of rain associated with that, and there's not enough discharge, so you can push past Delaware Bridge pretty easily in a storm event. But if you don't have anything, and it's and there's not like a big spring tide after, and there's not a lot of discharge coming down, right, depending on the time of year. So in the fall is generally when these big storms happen, you can have the salt front stay above river mile 70 easily. But this is where the management comes in. Like, we care about it because it's interesting, but managers are like, well, it's down by 70. So like, I don't need to worry about it yet.
No, did you worry about it down there?
Not really. But my
It's more like
another side, one of the interest that around the river mile, the C&D canal comes in. That area is very, very complex. And when I did one-dimensional model for impact of C&D canal, it has a dramatic impact on bay salinity distribution. So with all the 3D model, I mean, we are looking into that too, but it is quite interesting to see the dynamics between exchange between C&D canal and ocean comes in, depending on which direction C&D comes in and out. That changed the whole salinity distribution in the bay.
I see Ming has a question. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say the C&D canal is very interesting, very hard to include in the model. And it's generally a net import of fresh water from the Chesapeake. But during like a storm surge event, you can have it switch directions and have it be an export of salt into the Chesapeake.
Ming,
can I ask a question?
Yep.
Yeah, so look like right now the salt intrusion hasn't really get into the water intake in Philadelphia. Has anybody done scenario analysis for the future where the salt front will sneak to that water intake?
So we're pretty well protected right now. One sort of direction that we're going with our analyses is less looking at the sort of current policy changes and switching gears internally, now that the tools developed and everything to inform our infrastructure planning program, where we're going to be doing multiple increasing sea level rise runs to better understand what our salinity risk may be in the future under different flow combinations and sea level rise combinations, so that let's say 30, 40 years from now, we think that we're going to be seeing a lot more ocean salt than we typically do. We'll be able to put a range on that, give that to our infrastructure planners to begin to make some decisions, as they sort of are also overlaying other regulatory drivers and water quality drivers that sort of go into these decisions to make large capital investments and infrastructure changes. So we're going to be switching gears shortly to do that. That's a different set of runs than we've done currently. That would be a lot more sea level rise runs, other sort of sensitivity analyses around those to sort of frame out those scenarios as best we can, which is another reason why we're interested in the influence of these sort of set up, set down events. You know, we want to understand how protected we are in the future, and when we would want specific infrastructure changes in place, so that we don't have a sort of chronic salt problem in the summer months when flows are typically around 3,000 on the Delaware.
So Maury, you mentioned that you consider different projections, sea level rise, but I also heard that the channel dredging, you know, that depth increase could be much bigger. I thought most of the channel dredging was happened earlier in the last century, but I just heard there was dredging in 2020, right?
So there's maintenance dredging every year. They have to get the sediment out of the channel. Right now, the channel is dredged to be maintained at 45 feet. The shipping community would love it to be deeper. It's my understanding that there's not much an appetite for that. Now that they've gone down to 45 feet, a pretty good chunk of the shipping channel in the upper estuary has to be blasted out from the bedrock, and there's not much appetite for that. But, you know, as the water department, that's not really our call. We'll study whatever is happening and work with the policy agencies, you know, to understand the drinking water impacts of that. But it's my understanding that right now the shipping channel is at 45. It's going to stay at 45, but they do maintenance dredging every year. So there's sort of always dredging going on to get the basin sediment out of the channel.
I see. Now Quinn has a question. Do you want to?
Yes. I can see my control panel here, so I don't know whether you can hear me or whether
We
you
can hear you.
see
Yes,
me.
we hear you.
Okay, so I'm Zhao Qingyang from Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. So I see a few folks actually I know before. So we actually as one of the tasks actually in our integrated coastal modeling project funded by DOE Office of Science is to look at the salt water intrusion in the Delaware River and the bay. So we just actually finished one of the paper and going to submit by tomorrow. It's to look at the salt water intrusion length and also adjustment time, responding to sea level rise and also drought condition. So so far, to answer the questions, at least from our simulations, we don't see actually the salt water intrusion actually reach out to the intake point. So it seems also some based on our sensitivity analysis, it seems also not that sensitive to the salinity open boundary conditions. So, but it is sensitive to the sea level rise. So
yeah,
just want to share what we are doing, you know.
Thank you. Excellent.
Yeah,
good to hear. Dave?
Yeah, that'd be great if you could. Oh, sorry. Could you circulate a copy of that report maybe to Bob to share with us? We'd love to read that.
Yeah, it is not a report and it's a manuscript. So at some point, you know, we definitely would like to share. And I think I also was in one of the previous meeting with the DRBC meetings before, but anyway, I think we would like to reconnect it with this activity.
Okay, we had Dave.
I wonder if, yeah, I mean, so there's in addition to sea level rise and Ming mentioned dredging, are there other sort of factors that you all are thinking about or we should think about as far as potential risk or influencing changes in, future salt intrusion conditions? I mean, things I'm thinking about include the amount of river flow, the timing of the river flow, and then there's also stuff which is maybe harder to predict, like land use changes and or changes in chlorides from coming in from the upstream. And so I guess it seems like each of those is potentially an influence on the water quality, which is what you ultimately care about. And so how do you sort of compare those uncertainties with something maybe it's a little easier to quantify as far as the sea level rise projections?
I think some things we'd be interested in are, are there any potential changes in the ocean salinity due to sea level rise? What changes could we see in terms of salinity stratification in the bay due to sea level rise? Like right now, we already have some assumptions in our model related to depth and sort of salinity differences between the top and the bottom. So I think anything that you guys could provide on that would be a huge help to us.
Yeah, I just have another comment, and that's I think this comes from a previous student of Chris Summerfield's, Dave Walsh, when they had done a sediment budget of the bay, and they decided they concluded that there was this source of sediment from the erosion. It probably associated after dredging. There may have been some decadal scale geomorphological adjustment. Like you can imagine, you dig the channel down to 45 feet now, and then you do your maintenance ratio 45 feet, but there's some of the sides of the channel adjust over the next decade or so. And so even though they've just gone to 45 feet, there may still be some adjustment going forward in the bed and thus influence salt intrusion. So maybe it's something should be keep an eye on of morphological adjustment, which is always another hard thing, but one has to be worried about if you think about decadal scale variability. And to John's question about 2016, I remember I have looked at you definitely can see an increase in tides in upstream after the 2016 deepening. John, you have another question? Or did I not lower your hand?
Yeah, no, I've got a question or a comment. One of the things that I was worried about when I was looking at this stuff is, and this has got to do with the biology again, most of what you're not talking about. But if you change the shape of the shoreline with sea level rise in the lower bay, you've got a very extensive marshes there, and if those become inundated, you're liable to change the configuration of the bay such that the gyres that exist, which tend to concentrate the oyster larvae and other things, may change dramatically. That plus the position of the frontal systems that are in that lower bay. This dramatically changed the entire circulation pattern. And I don't know whether I presume you could make your models work on that. But in terms of the lower bay, that might be the most significant change of sea level rise, in my view, is the very fact that you're liable to change the shorelines dramatically. And this caused more erosion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another comment, years ago, I think it was the Corps of Engineers gave a report, and it always surprised me, really surprised me, but the volume of sediment they're having to dredge from the Delaware to maintain the channel is decreasing. So there's less sediment accumulating within the Delaware system, at least according to that report, which I thought was pretty fascinating. When you live in the Delaware, it's turbid all the time. So, but they have pretty good evidence that they're not having to take as much sediment out of the bay to maintain the channels as they used to.
That is interesting.
Yeah, I'm pretty curious if the marshes will keep up with sea level rise, given like the sediment supply in the Delaware? And another question I'm curious about is if we're entering a new climate regime where it's going to be rainier, I wonder what that will do to sediment supply from tributaries into the system, and what effect that might have. Those are some questions I'm interested in.
Question from Dan Barone. In the absence of major storms, what is the threshold for future sea level rise? I'm gonna have him invite him in here to ask that question.
I think that's something that we're looking to find out, but we haven't done the modeling yet to get that answer.
Okay.
There's another question from Dr. Ibrahim.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you face land subsidence at your study area? Because in our case, in the delta region, cumulative impact of sea level rise, land subsidence, and seawater intrusion change the quality of the fresh water. Okay,
Yes,
this is more a modeling question.
Well, this is the answer. Yeah, yes. There is like what is it about a third of a centimeter per year subsidence around here. So like global sea level rise like 3 millimeters a year. I think we get another 3 to 4 millimeters a year of land subsidence. Does anybody want to correct me on that if that's about? So we're seeing like 0.6, 0.5, 0.5 centimeters per year. 0.5 centimeter per year sea level rise. 0.4, 0.5. I see hands up. I can't turn them off. So if Zhao, Quinn, or John has questions, you can go ahead and answer them. If not, lower your. So, all right. Any other questions from the audience or panel? I feel like asking names. Sue, what keeps you up at night? Related to the river, right?
Oh, I sleep well.
Okay, good. Okay, okay, good. Okay. All right. Well, I think we're past 2:30. There were so we had about 50, a total of 50 people here today. That's I think I was happy to see that. It was sort of late getting advertised on my part, but that's a good showing. And September is a hard month, I think. So anyway, any final questions, comments? Ming, you want to say anything about about what's next, or what?
I think Dave is probably going to organize another panel discussion on Hudson River sometime in the fall, right?
That's right. Yep, that's in the process, and we'll hopefully have an announcement on that shortly.
Yeah, and remember you signed into the Zoom meeting. We were also able to register for this webinar, and if you do that, you will get emails in the future about upcoming webinars. And we're gonna, the idea is we had Potomac, Delaware, Hudson. We're gonna go to the West Coast, and then travel around the virtually around the world, and then a year or so from now there will be a in-person workshop, probably in the Philadelphia area. So that'll be interesting to sort of compare notes from all these talks. And they're recorded, right, Ming? And they can be people can go back and watch the presentations, right?
Yeah, I think we share the recorded webinar with people.
Right.
Yeah. If they cannot make today, they could listen to it later.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Any final comments, questions? We'll call it a day. Thank you for all your speakers too. Excellent talks. Really.
Thanks, guys. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ming.
Thanks a lot.